Okay, this is a video on Chapter 4.3 in the course materials about blank check companies and, to a smaller degree, the special purpose acquisition companies. So, if you recall from the first part of this course, you talked about the procedures for taking a privately held company public to trade on the public exchanges. And so that public offering is regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission. And basically, the private company has to do a Section 5 registration with the SEC under the 1933 Securities Act. And there are restrictions on that company's selling or offering to sell or promoting that stock before the registration statement is approved and effective. So, and during that time, before it becomes effective, or actually even before filing the registration statement, the company is spending a lot of time cleaning up the company, settling lawsuits, verifying its legal position on a number of issues, for example, verifying it has legal title to patents and trademarks, and settling lawsuits and other issues. So it's trying to look good when it finally is presenting itself to the public. So this whole process is very time-consuming, expensive process. It involves accountants, lawyers, engineers. There's a lot going on to get this done. And it's actually a bit overly expensive for smaller companies. So there are a number of exemptions from this Section 5 filing, and you studied them last semester. You recall there were the intrastate offering if the securities are offered solely within one state. It's a very difficult exception to satisfy because it's very easy to suddenly expand into an interstate market by using interstate communication facilities, phone lines, internet, etc. Small offerings, private offerings will be exempt. The most popular would be Regulation D. You remember 504, 505, 506 from last semester. 506 probably being, the more popular of the Reg D exemptions. The important point to remember there is that these offerings, although exempt from the Section 5 filing requirement, are still securities. They are still securities, and it means they are still subject to all of the securities laws. So insider trading, 10b-5, etc. And the simple rule to remember here is that if you have a security, the security either must be registered through the Section 5 process, or it is exempt from registration like we've just talked about, or it's illegal. And that's it. It's pretty simple. It's going to fall into one of those three categories if you actually have a security. So the blank check companies are a way to take a privately held company to the public exchanges, technically without going through a Section 5 registration process. And it has become a backdoor way for companies, privately held companies, to access the public exchanges without the intense scrutiny of a Section 5 filing, and even avoiding the exemptions, in some cases the onerous requirements of the Reg D exemptions, for example. So this is kind of a backdoor way. It has been troubling for the Securities Exchange Commission, and just want to take a few minutes to go over how the blank check company works. Again, this is a backdoor way to take a company that is privately held to the public exchanges. So basically, the blank check company does a Section 5 filing. It makes a Section 5 filing, but the fact is it really has no assets. There's nothing in it. there's nothing more than the promoters of the blank check company and some small office somewhere and a handful of people that are promoting the blank check company. So when the SEC receives the Section 5 filing, there's really nothing for it to review. I mean, there are really virtually no accounts, there are no assets, there's no ongoing business, there's nothing. And so, as a result, there's nothing to hold up the registration process, and it gets approved. So the question is, well, what is the purpose here? The purpose is to do an IPO, sell stock in the blank check company, and basically build up a war chest of cash for purposes of merging or acquiring with other companies. And that's what blank check companies are. They're empty shells with a big war chest of cash whose sole purpose is to go out and merge and acquire other companies. So what happens is people buy stock in this company, and they're given the impression that, let's say, the Section 5 statement says, we are looking for the next Apple or the next Google, and we want to acquire that company, and that's our mission. So that's what we're spending the money on. So what happens is, you say, okay, good, I want to share the next Google or next Apple. So here's my money. Here's my 10,000. Here's my 50,000. Whatever it is, they build up a war chest of $10-15 million, maybe more, and you call back, 6 months later. So, well, how's it coming? Did you find that next Apple, that next Google company? And you talk to the public relations. Well, no, we haven't quite found it yet. We're shopping around, and we were out in Silicon Valley, and then we were up in Boston, and then we decided to go overseas. We went to France and Germany, and I took my wife, and we went to the Riviera, and we're still looking. We don't have anything, but check back in about 6 months. So 6 months later, you call back. How's that coming? Well, we still don't have that target company. We did go to Singapore, went to Shanghai, had a great time in India. We rode some elephants in Rajasthan and saw some of the palaces. We had a great time. Took my wife and kids, but no, we don't have anything. You get the point. The point is they're burning through this money, and they're not doing anything. And you can see the point here is that the vehicle becomes a vehicle for potential fraud. And you get to the end of the period, and well, did you find a company? No, we're pretty much out of money. Hey, but we're going to do another round of financing, and I think on the second round, I think we're going to find something. So, this is what happens. The money disappears, the investors are defrauded, and there is no Apple or Google foreign acquisition. So this is the reason why the SEC has decided to regulate these kinds of companies, and because the potential for fraud is just tremendous. So they are regulated under Rule 419 of these rules. So let me just briefly mention SPACs, Special Purpose Acquisition Companies. SPACs are basically the same thing as blank check companies. So if you hear one or the other, they're basically set up for the same purpose. They're empty shells whose purpose is to merge or acquire with other companies. The Rule 419 technically only applies to blank check companies, and those are companies whose stock price is less than the penny stock. If it's more than a penny stock, then they are not subject to SEC regulation. They're subject to the exchange. So what I'm saying is the exchanges have rules very similar to Rule 419 to regulate these special purpose acquisition companies. So we're not going to study the rules in the exchanges. We are just going to look at Rule 419. And by looking at 419, you will get a sense of how the rules on the exchanges work, because they will be different, but they'll be the same concept. So they're basically the same, SPACs and check companies. So the way this works, the way this is bypassed, is that if they actually do acquire a company, a privately held company, the privately held company is merged into this publicly traded company, and suddenly that privately held company is now traded on the national exchange. And it's now traded on the exchange, but that privately held company has never gone through a Section 5 review procedure. So nobody has really examined, or the SEC has never examined, the books and records. They've never examined the business, the viability of the business, whether potential claims against the company, lawsuits, fraud, bribery, anything, nothing. It's never there. And the people, the investors who bought into the blank check company suddenly now own this privately held company that's never been through a review process, and those investors have never had a chance to see the company that has been acquired. And they're kind of on the hook for whatever the acquisition was. So that is the point. That one, the vehicle, blank check company is potentially a vehicle for fraud, and number two, the investors in the blank check company never really have an opportunity to see what they are acquiring until after the deal is done. So Rule 419 is basically how the SEC is regulating these blank check companies. And let's just take a look at Rule 419. Now a copy of this is on Blackboard, and you should download it and print it out and take a look at it. And the version on Blackboard has some yellow highlight. This version has some portions of the rule which are underlined here. All right, so you see first here, Rule 419 applies to offerings by blank check companies, and it gives a definition of the blank check company, which is basically it's a development stage company that has no specific business plan or purpose, or is indicated its purpose is basically to do a merger or acquisition. In other words, it's basically a shell company. So what the SEC does is it requires that after the IPO is done, that all the proceeds be deposited into an escrow account. And you first get to pay off all your expenses and commissions and things like that, legal expenses, accounting expenses. But whatever's left is then deposited into an escrow account, which means that now the money is outside the control of the management of the blank check company. It's in an escrow account, and the escrow agreement normally will say when and how those funds can be withdrawn, which would be limited to a merger or acquisition of a company. In other words, they can't just take the money out willy-nilly and start spending it on trips around the world, ostensibly for the purpose of acquiring a company. They do get up to 10% of the net proceeds for purposes of operations and for finding that acquisition and merger. So in other words, if they raised, let's say, $12 million, they would be allowed to take up to $1.2 million, the $12 million after all the expenses are paid. They would be allowed to take up to $1.2 million for purposes of salaries, overhead, offices, travel, consulting fees for accountants, lawyers, engineers, etc., to fulfill whatever their objective is. So now you see there's a cap on how much is actually at risk. 90% is held in the escrow account and preserved for the acquisition, and only 10%, up to 10%, can be potentially fraudulently used or wasted. So there's a cap on the exposure that the investors have. And the rule says that a copy of the escrow agreement shall be included with the registration statement. So in other words, investors will see where their money is going to be deposited, Citibank or JP Morgan Chase, whatever. You'll get to see the terms of the registration statement. So now the company's looking for a target, and as soon as, notice the words in the rule, a significant acquisition becomes probable, the registrant shall promptly file a post-effective amendment, basically telling the investors what it's thinking of doing. Now, notice the word probable. Probable means more likely than not. And so it's kind of a low-level standard. But it means, for example, they're in serious discussions. They've identified a company. The target company might be receptive to it. They're sitting down having discussions, working out details about how they would complete the merger or acquisition. And somewhere in there's a time frame. It's not clear, but somewhere in there they have to file an amendment to the registration saying that we are doing this, and tell people what they are doing. And, you know, the part of the issue here is that when investors bought into this blank check company, they may have bought into it because of the expectation of, you know, getting an ex-Google or Apple high-tech company. But maybe in the course of searching for companies, they found some other company they like. Maybe they found a paint company in India, a privately held paint company in India, and they think, well, let's acquire the paint company and we'll manufacture all this paint, and then we will sell it to Sears and Roebuck and Walmart and all the, you know, Target or wherever you buy paint, and we'll have a great business, you know, just from that. But maybe you decide you don't want to be in the paint business. I mean, that's not what you want to do. You don't want to be in the paint business. You want to be in the Google, Apple, high-tech business. So, you know, this kind of amendment to the registration statement gets, you know, tells you, hey, you know, here's what we're doing. And if you don't like it, it gives you an opportunity to say, hey, I'm out of this. I don't want to be in the paint business. I want a Google, Apple company. All right, so this is a notice provision to the investors. So then, release of the funds. Here you see that when they finally have a target, which is going to take at least 80% of the maximum offering proceeds. So let's say if it's 12 million, 80% would be 9.6 million. So if the acquisition is 9.6 million or more, I guess, you know, now the registrant shall file another post-effective amendment that basically gives more detail about what it is doing. And this statement is due when they have actually executed an agreement for the acquisition. They've actually executed the agreement for the acquisition. Now, as you know, the executing the agreement itself does not necessarily mean the deal is done, because all of those agreements will have provisions in there that will say, you know, subject to the approval of the board of directors within, you know, 60 days, 90 days from the effective date of this agreement. So the point being that, you know, the agents of the respective companies negotiate this deal. They don't have actual or real authority to finalize it. They have authority to sign an agreement that says they have to get the final authorization from the board. And this goes exactly to the issues you did in the first part of this course with principal agent, scope of authority, and all of those issues. So that is how these concepts are implemented in this type of agreement. So they execute the agreement subject to approval of the boards, etc. But the point is, upon execution, then they are required to file this post-effective amendment. And again, this now gives the investors an even better opportunity to decide to see in this deal or not. And the significance here is that within 5 business days after the effective date of that amendment, so remember, the SEC gets it, and they're going to review it, and it'll be effective when they approve it. The blank check company has to give notice to the investors by first-class mail or other appropriate means. They have to notify all of the investors, here's what we are doing. So there's a notice requirement. And here's the important part. Each investor shall then have no fewer than 20 business days and no more than 45 business days from the effective date of the post-effective amendment to notify the registry in writing that the purchaser elects to remain an investor. So within 20 to 45 days, the investors must affirmatively say, I want to be in this deal. In other words, they have to opt into the deal. And if they don't opt in, or if you don't hear from them, what it says is that they are deemed to have been opted out. So this is an opt-in rule. They are, or however you want to say it, they're out unless they have explicitly opted in. It takes an affirmative act on their part to say, I want to be in this deal. I want to be in the paint business and not the Apple, Google, high-tech business. And if they don't hear from the investors, or the investors are out of the deal, then they have to return money to those investors within 5 business days. Within 5 business. So you see, this is very quick. And the other kicker here is that the blank check company now has only 18 months to consummate the deal. 18 months from the effective date of the initial registration statement. So you see all the protections in this rule. You see all the protections in this rule where investors are protected in the sense their money is first placed in an escrow account out of the hands of the blank check company, number one. Number two, the amount of money the blank check company can take to actually effectuate the business plan is limited to up to 10% of the IPO funds. In the example I've used, 12 million and 1.2 million. The blank check company has 18 months. Now there's a time limit to actually effectuate this whole thing, 18 months to consummate the transaction. And there are several steps, 2 steps along the way where they have to notify investors when the transaction, is probable and when they have actually executed an agreement. And these all give investors an opportunity to get out of the deal. And in fact, in the second one, after they've executed the agreement, the investors are actually deemed to be out of the deal unless they affirmatively say they are in the deal. So this is Rule 419, and this is how the SEC is regulating these blank check companies for the purpose of protecting investors. And there is a problem here for you to take a look at. And to do this problem and work through Rule 419 and just answer these 5 questions along the way and see how they come out under Rule 419.